love the topic of this forum because usually when we talk about cities, we talk about finances or ecology, and that is housing crisis and mobility. But in the same time, in the last few years, we've seen an increased discussion about mental health, that the younger generation is suffering from anxiety, depression, loneliness, they're having less friends, less sex, and it's a little bit weird to understand, so that's why I think that maybe cultural architecture is something that we should focus on also when we discuss about urban planning, and that's why this is the topic of my presentation. CHYBIK+KRISTOF, we are a studio based in Slovakia and Czech Republic, also in London, and we are operating right now in this typology, mostly in Central Europe, or what used to be known as Eastern Europe. And that is something important later I will explain. We are trying to gather all the information on our work on this typology and try to find some similar approaches or on how to turn cultural architecture into public infrastructure and to serve the public. This is a project of an art gallery we have in a small town in Czech Republic. This used to be a textile factory called Perla, and our approach is very simple. We just cut the building in some part in order to create a parallel new square that connects with the city center. This way, the art gallery does not serve only to a specific target group, but to all the city. Another approach that we have is trying to integrate old or historical sites to the public infrastructure, and this is the mental house when the DNA was discovered. We renovated and rebuilt, actually we rebuilt the old greenhouse precisely in the footprint where it used to be. It's founded by an NGO, but we wanted it to serve to the public and be multifunctional and easily adapted to any kind of function, and right now it's one of the most visited places in Brno. Also, something that we try to play with is trying to create a cultural space that is not dedicated to only one function, but can function for all kinds of programs, and we're trying to work with the modularity of spaces and introduce their coffee spaces and also commercial purposes. This is a project that is actually very important also to Albanian context. This is the biggest competition for a cultural object in Czech Republic, which is also a trend, as Petra was mentioning about Bratislava. We have similar trends when in Albania and also in Central Europe when it comes to public space. Our Skanderbeg Square is an equivalent square in Bratislava, in Warsaw, in Brno. And also there is some new discussion, I think, and it's a new trend related to cultural architecture or representative cultural architecture that is happening in Czech Republic, in Bratislava, with the National Gallery, in Poland, and also in Hungary. In this project, we didn't want to create a monumental singular building that does not communicate with the surroundings, but it's just trying to show off the country's potential or prestige, but we wanted to work with the site, with the river, and also with all the paths, pedestrian connections around, and the shape of the building is a reflection of all the potential connections that we can have with the pedestrians. So we tried to combine two ideas. One is to create something also representative for the country, since it's the biggest investment after the fall of communism happening in Prague, but also we wanted to make it functional in daily basis and for everyone. And here we come on what is similar between all of these countries. This is research data that I'm working for only a couple of months. It's still an ongoing project. This is the data from Albania, but if we see this data in Czech Republic, in Slovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, it's always going to look something very similar. We're going to experience a huge fall in the 90s, in the years when practically I was born. In all of these countries we have a lack of investment in cultural architecture. And we see a potential trend to start to invest in culture and architecture again in the 2010s or 2020s. It looks a little bit sad right now, the 20s, but it's just because we have only half of the decade calculated for the moment. So what is interesting is there is this research happening also in Czech Republic, in the Academy of Science there, and University of Fine Arts. Also in Bratislava, it's a project of the Slovak Academy of Science. Some similar projects are happening in Croatia and Hungary, I think, and also Poland. And I wanted to jump in this discussion about trying to understand what is the stock of cultural infrastructure that we have in our countries, and if we can find some similar trends of what happened, and if we can find some similar trends of what is going to happen. And it's really interesting because we have a lot in common, and in some small details when changes occur, it's interesting to see how that reflected to how our countries are different nowadays and how our societies operate different nowadays. So what is similar is that the whole concept that I was talking earlier about the culture as a public domain started with the Enlightenment movement, and in Albania, due to the fact that we were not a stable country, it didn't get translated into architectural objects. It was mostly guerrilla architecture as the first school, or it was mostly like colonial architecture as the first national theater. While in this period of time in Central Europe, we saw a new typology, which was called House of People or House of Culture, which was supposed to host everybody and teach everybody how to read, how to write, and it worked mostly in the after work. After people finished work, they used to visit these places. In Albania, we don't have that before the Second World War, but after Second World War, we have a moment that we collaborated intensively between each other. A lot of architects from Central Europe, mostly Czechoslovakia and Poland and Eastern Germany, moved to Albania. We borrowed a lot of blueprints, mostly about landscape, and also for prefabrication during those years. And it's a very similar trend of nowadays of how we're opening this discussion internationally, but then internationally was something different. During this time, we have a lot of investment in infrastructure in Albania, and this is very easily translated into investment in culture. The most interesting story of cultural architecture in Albania is the opera building, which originally is designed and it still functions as a palace of culture. What is interesting in all this documentation, I'm looking in the archives, it's a lot of discussion about the functions of the building. So these buildings were not designed as this is a theater and that's all, or this is an opera and that's all. But they were designing precisely the number of books sometimes. We need a bookstore in the corner, but not so big that people will think it's a library. We need a coffee shop, but not too many tables, because people will think it's a coffee place. So they were trying to balance this multifunctionality of the building. And it's interesting because opera even nowadays works like that. It's a place when everybody meets. It's not like the Palace of Congress, that it's a building you don't visit if there is no event, but it operates daily and it works 24 hours. And everybody who comes from abroad, even when I come here and I call somebody for a coffee, they're like, let's meet in Botanica, let's meet in opera. And it's only due to this fact that it was designed precisely to be multifunctional. This was a Soviet initiative that later we finished by ourselves, and it became a symbol of nationalism in Albania, and women actually worked on the final moments of the project, and it became a huge propaganda tool for the regime. But despite of that, the original concept of this typology was not communist per se, or it wasn't totalitarian per se. What happened later, it's if in Czech Republic, houses of culture became also sometimes places to host dissident movements. In Albania, during the culture revolution, it became even more closed, even more controlled. And what is interesting is all the site plans of villages, new villages or new towns in Albania, that always the the building that was supposed to be the House of Culture is in the entrance of the village, and it's #1 in the legend. So all the new cities and new villages in Albania were first House of Culture, and then it was municipality, some place to eat, and to create this new center of the villages. But always the main building in the whole new site was the House of Culture. Even when we had the collapse of economy and the country got super isolated, what is interesting and a little bit also sad thinking about what was really happening is that the only typology that didn't stop was the culture infrastructure, because in this moment it turned into a propaganda tool. And during those years everything got standardized, and they created the cheapest possible building, and they start to build it everywhere around the country. So if we see in the map, from each decade to the end, we covered practically the whole footprint of the country. What is interesting in this data is that I'm counting right now only infrastructure in cities, not in villages, not in rural, remote, or industrial sites. If I would do that, I would have a graph that goes to like 1,000. And what is interesting also is that in our calculation and comparing data with other researchers in Central Europe, we have around 4 times more infrastructure related to culture than Czechoslovakia, for example, if we count the population and the size of the country. What happened after the 90s? I skipped the 90s, I went immediately into in the 2010. It's that somehow we start to invest again, and right now I'm also adding data related to policies, like what kind of laws did we make in precise moments, and how these laws or GDP changes reflected the policies related to culture. We are starting again to invest in culture infrastructure, and mostly it's in Tirana, and in what have been historically cultural centers of Albania, Korça, Gjirokastër, Shkodër, and something in Vlora also. What is visible is that we have 2 trends. We are renovating a lot of museums in Albania. We are spending a lot of money in renovation. Most of these green dots are not new buildings, are renovation of existing ones. We are investing a lot in representative architecture. And I think that Pyramida is something that functions both ways, also as a multi-purpose center, but also as a representative architecture. So the goal of this research that I'm working is to create a database that we can understand the flow of development and the impact of the development of the sector of culture in architecture in Albania, and also be able to generate from that similar trends that occurred in different spaces in Albania, and understand where we have potential, since we have this crazy stock of architecture for the field. And also try to understand that what we are designing right now is a reflection of what we have and what we are lacking in the last 30 years of stagnation in this sector. So one competition that was organized in Tirana lately, it was the ODA competition, and we understood this also as a task that we need to invest in something representative for the country, but also keep it very open and keep it as a public space for the city. And one very interesting competition that happened in Albania in this field, it was Expo last year. We didn't make it to the second phase, but I think that proposals that don't win are good proposals for forums to talk about. So this is a very interesting context, because it's in a small village near Tirana, and we had to design there an expo, which is a super huge building. So we fell in love with the nature around Farka, with the valley and the local culture there. And it's a nice story, because it used to be a communist military land that is supposed to become an international cultural space. We didn't know how to feel about it in the beginning, because it was a very huge building in a very pure environment. So we came up with the idea to keep it very simple and just dig it down. This approach allowed us to create a hill when local people could still use it as a public space, could still use it as a open public space, and also have a square there for the village. So the scale of the building kind of shrinks. And at the same time, together with Igor Marko, we came up with the idea to create a representative green roof where each part symbolized some value of, or some specific of Albanian nature. So also in this task, we were trying to play with the idea of creating something monumental, representative for the country, because in one sense we are lacking that for 30 years, and also all these countries of Eastern Bloc are lacking that in the past 30 years. But keep the idea of investing for the public in the first place. So this is what architects in terms of design can do, and my question is like, what kind of policies can the state do to invest more in culture? I don't think that it's enough just for the architects to design. I think it's a matter of collaboration, and that's all. If we can have lunch. No? Do I have questions?